Good morning. Thank you for joining today's webinar on human milk feeding for small, sick newborns. My name is Julia Crowley and I'm with the TOPS program. Before we get started, I want to go over a few logistical details for today's webinar. Please note that all microphones are turned off. So if you are having any problems with audio or are not able to hear, please enter in the chat box and we're going to work with you to solve the problem. During the presentation, if you have any questions, comments, or would like additional details on particular items, please enter in the chat box at the right of the screen, and your questions will be answered after the presentation. At the end of World Breastfeeding Week, the presentations will be posted online at the FSN Network website. I will now hand this over to Joan Dennings, Nutrition and Food Technology Senior Specialist at the TOPS program.
Welcome to the fourth day of the USAID World Breastfeeding Week webinar series. Today we will continue to highlight the ways in which USAID implementing partners work to sustain progress in breastfeeding together, with a presentation from Every Preemie Scale about human milk feeding for small and sick newborns. As you can see, the webinar series was launched by Ann Peniston, Division Chief of the Nutrition Unit of USAID, on July 31st, with a presentation by MCSP on barriers to breastfeeding. August 1st, Emergency Nutrition Advisor Sarah Butler from Save the Children presented on working together to save lives in emergencies. Yesterday, the ASSIST project presented on the Global Partnership for HIV-Free Survival. Please be sure and join tomorrow for the final webinar to hear about the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative in Malawi. Please note there are additional resources available, and here are some links to those. We're hoping this series continues to focus on the protection, promotion, and support of breastfeeding. Besides the documents from USAID shown, on August 29th in 2016, USAID with partner FHI 360 and Fanta and Alive and Thrive hosted a breastfeeding symposium. This year, from May 9th to 11th, the TOPS program, with support from USAID's Office of Food for Peace, held a breastfeeding seminar. Presentations from both of those events can be found on those websites. And we would like to call note that there are various activities going on with World Breastfeeding Week, but another webinar series that might be of interest is through the Civil Society Network of the SUN program, Scaling Up Nutrition. If you go to that website for SUN Civil Society Network, you will find the list of webinars on the International Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes and new global guidance on marketing infant foods. Our first webinar will have its second presentation today at 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. You will see the other webinars listed at that website. With that, I will hand over to Judith McCord, the Director of Every Preemie Scale.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much to all of you who have organized this webinar series. It's a huge contribution to the global dialogue around improving the health of newborns in general, and then today we'll look more specifically at small and sick newborns. We recently worked with Dr. Spatz to develop a technical brief on human milk feeding for small and sick newborns, so we're really pleased that she could join us today. Dr. Spatz is a professor of perinatal nursing at the Helen M. Scheer Professor of Nutrition at the University of Pennsylvania School of Nursing, and shares a joint appointment as a nurse researcher and director of the lactation program at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and is also the clinical coordinator of the hospital's Mother's Milk Bank. Dr. Spatz is an active researcher, clinician, and educator who is internationally recognized for her work surrounding the use of human milk in breastfeeding, particularly in vulnerable populations. In 2004, Dr. Spatz developed her 10-step model for human milk and breastfeeding in vulnerable infants, and the model has been implemented in NICUs throughout the United States and in other countries worldwide. And we'll hear more about that model today. Dr. Spatz is immediate past chair of the American Academy of Nursing's expert panel on breastfeeding and their representative to the United States Breastfeeding Committee. She is also a member of the International Society for Researchers in Human Milk and Lactation. So I'm very pleased, Dr. Spatz, that you can be with us today, and I'll now turn over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. It is very exciting for me to be here today. I have spent my entire career working with mothers and infants. It is the only thing I have ever done. I am very fortunate in that I have a joint appointment between the University of Pennsylvania as well as the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, as you heard in my introduction. So at the University of Pennsylvania, we actually hold an entire semester undergraduate course on human milk and breastfeeding. This is for undergraduate nursing students, and they receive 28 hours of lecture content as well as 14 hours of clinical field work on human milk and breastfeeding. So as you can imagine, graduating from that course, you have quite a different experience in terms of being able to support mothers and their children. At the hospital part of my job, I oversee everything related to the human milk and breastfeeding activities. And at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, we are an international referral center for vulnerable infants. So a typical baby at Children's Hospital might be in the hospital for several months. And this child who I have shown on this slide is baby Charlotte. And baby Charlotte had a giant umphalocele. And this umphalocele defect required 8 surgical procedures in order to close that. Her mother was exclusively pump dependent for 2.5 months. The middle picture is when baby Charlotte was finally able to go to the breast, and this is her 1-year-old birthday. She received human milk and was breastfed for her whole first year of life. In addition, her mother was able to maintain a milk supply of over 1,000 mLs per day, and she was able to donate extra milk to the milk bank. So my goal for us today is really looking at how we can preserve human milk and breastfeeding so that all infants, if they are born small, sick, vulnerable, will have access to their mother's own milk. You all know that this is a public health issue. I'm not having to convince anyone on the phone that we know that globally, both mothers and children are dying from a lack of human milk. We also know that this is impacting our societies globally because human milk has an important role in the development of the brain and developmental outcomes. And when we think about this and look at that Lancet series that came out in 2016, this is a true public health issue. Much of the focus, however, has been on the healthy term baby versus those that really need access to the mother's milk, the ones that are born small or sick. So as you are aware, despite long-standing recommendations about the importance of human milk and breastfeeding, we still have less than 40% of infants receiving exclusive human milk for the first 6 months. If you look globally, there is not really any data collected across the world about human milk outcomes for NICU infants, for babies who are born small and sick. In the United States, data from the Vermont Oxford Network shows that at hospital discharge for very low birth weight infants, babies that are less than 1,500 grams, less than half of them are going home on human milk feeds. So the vast majority of sick babies are being fed formula. And I've seen this in my work around the globe. When we think about this access to human milk as being a public health issue, and we think about the fact of what is happening globally, it's not just that human milk and breastfeeding is so important for health outcomes, but it's also the risks that are associated with formula feeding. And many years ago, my colleague from Children's Hospital and I published a position statement for the International Lactation Consultant Association. And even though that was several years ago, the risks are still there. Formula can be recalled, it can be contaminated, we can have a lack of access to clean water to mix formula. And most recently, when I was in India in 2016, I had a family who they were told the hospital does not provide formula. The families have to provide their own. And the mother brought in a tin of formula, and when the nurse opened it up, it had worms in it. So when you think about the position that a nurse is put in a family, if they don't have access to mom's own milk, the alternative is really not ideal for especially sick babies. And formula marketing is pervasive. I have just a couple ads as examples here. The one on the left is actually from Thailand, and I find it interesting because I've been working in Thailand for the past 5 years. And this is actually an advertisement for a private hospital. And in Thailand, people can give birth in both private and public hospitals. But one of the selling points for delivering in the private hospital for a pretty reasonable price, this is about less than $900 US, is they advertised a gift of free infant formula. And I always say to my colleagues, do these babies and mothers actually look like they're Thai? And so I always say they're unfortunately marketing the American way. And so it is really concerning. And this was actually in the airport in Germany. This is, I see all over happening, no matter in what country you're in, whether it be India, Thailand, even in countries where the code is supposedly being followed, you see violations on a daily basis. And if moms are really being marketed and they don't understand the value of human milk compared to formula, it's very easy for a woman to be swayed because of all different types of barriers and not be able to provide human milk or breastfeed her child. Many of you may have seen the new report from the WHO about the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative. I've been waiting for this to come out for quite some time and was very anxious to see it be released. I won't spend much time on it, but I do want to just point out that the concerns from the report are that there haven't been effective reassessment procedures. Facilities don't have internal monitoring systems to ensure that the principles are maintained. And then when reassessments are conducted, many fail to qualify for designation. After 25 years of implementation, the percent of facilities that have been designated as baby-friendly remains quite low. And globally, only about 10% of births occur in facilities that are still designated as baby-friendly. So from my perspective, my other concern about the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative is that that initiative is very much focused on healthy term mothers and infants. So mothers who have no complications, infants who have no complications. It doesn't really focus primarily on maternal-infant separation. And so even in countries where they have done a great job at working on baby friendly, oftentimes the infants who go to neonatal intensive care units have been kind of ignored. And I've seen this both in the United States and in low to middle income countries that I have worked in globally. And so we really have to consider what are the needs of that sick or small baby. And when you think about that focus of how the BFHI is designed, the goal is having babies be skin to skin immediately at birth, having babies be breastfeeding within an hour of birth, having moms and babies together 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. However, when you talk about the critically ill infant or the small or sick infant, these infants are going to require a different type of care to ensure that mothers can provide milk and to direct breastfeed them. And so we have to think about what policy, what education, what kind of training needs to occur. And that training or education needs to be quite different than the focus for mothers who have healthy term infants. So my entire career as a nurse in the United States, and then also now working globally, has only been dealing with critically ill mothers and children. And so here in the United States, a typical baby who we might have to care for is going to be born, they're going to be intubated, they may be on a ventilator for any length of time, they may require surgical procedures, they start off life with IV nutrition, total parental nutrition. And if you want to take a mother from being able to have this critically ill intubated baby and get her to the point where she can actually direct breastfeed, we're going to have a very detailed and clear mapped out process so that she is able to establish milk supply, maintain milk supply, and then get to the point of direct breastfeeding. So when we think about vulnerable infants, to try to take the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative and kind of just force that into vulnerable infants, infants who start off life intubated, needing oxygen, IV lines, feeding tubes, we have to really think about how are we going to take those mothers through that process in order to be able to get to that point where their baby can receive human milk throughout the whole hospital stay and even beyond. So when I was recruited to come to Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, I had prior to that worked on a grant that was funded by the National Institute of Health. And on that grant that we had by the National Institute of Health, we used master's prepared advanced practice nurses to follow women who had low birth weight infants, so all the babies were less than 2,500 grams. We enrolled them at the time of hospital admission, and the intervention group was assigned to master's prepared advanced practice nurses, and they could follow the mothers through the infant hospital stay and for 8 weeks post-discharge. The routine care group got the routine hospital services. And what we found is that, lo and behold, if you give moms education and support, your human milk and breastfeeding rates go up dramatically. And so after this NIH grant finished, and I was recruited to go to Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, based on my research and knowing, being intimately familiar with the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative, I really knew that we had to develop a different model in order to look at human milk and breastfeeding for the sick infant, for the small newborn, the sick infant, the vulnerable infant. And so these are the 10 steps based on the research that we conducted from the NIH grant and from my clinical practice. We have tested this model now in various NICUs around the United States, as well as many countries, which I'll talk about across the globe. what I can tell you for doing this work, really for my whole career, is that we have to invest our time early and often with mothers who have small or sick newborns. And so if you look at the first 5 steps, today during my talk, that is what I'm only going to focus on, is these first 5 steps. Actually, I'm going into 6 and 7 a little bit too. But what we have seen both in the United States and globally is that if we do a really good job early on, especially with steps 1 and 2, we are going to be able to get moms to direct breastfeeding and have babies be able to get 1, human milk as their first feed, 2, 100% human milk diet while the babies are in the hospital, and then 3, babies going to direct breastfeeding and breastfeeding at discharge from the hospital. So just to give you an example of outcomes from my institution where I work in the United States in Philadelphia, we are a referral center for critically ill babies. We have mothers who travel to us sometimes from other countries in the world as well as across the United States to deliver with us because they have infants with complex surgical anomalies and congenital anomalies. We have virtually 100% of our mothers initiate pumping for their babies. All of our babies are critically ill, so our mothers do have to start out by expressing milk. We do track our breastfeeding rates or human milk rates quite carefully, and over 86% of our infants do go home from human milk if they require neonatal intensive care. And then we also did a post-discharge study to see if the mothers were able to continue breastfeeding, and the average and median duration was 8 months, with a range all the way up to 30 months. Locally here in the United States, Tampa General Hospital in Florida also implemented this model that I developed, and they had their rates of human milk and breastfeeding all go up significantly. They had more babies who received human milk as their first feed. We had more babies who went home on human milk, and we also had families who were happier. I think what's so important to remember is that it's quite important to think about not only that babies are receiving human milk as their first feed, but that they're receiving human milk the entire hospital stay, and that we are sending babies home on human milk and breastfeeding. And all of these findings were statistically significant. So I have been working in Thailand since 2013. I was invited there by the Thai Breastfeeding Foundation and the Thai government. This was started based on work from a doctoral student of mine who came to study at the University of Pennsylvania. This is a countrywide implementation, and we have seen that the human milk rates have gone up in Thailand anywhere between 3- and 6-fold. Initially, we had 6 pilot hospitals who started. We added another 10 in 2014 and another 9 in 2015. And so in these 25 pioneer hospitals, they have fully implemented the 10-step model and have increases in their human milk rate, as I mentioned, anywhere between 3- and 6-fold. They are working on a countrywide scale up, and by 2020, their goal is to have every NICU in Thailand have implemented my model. They have done some amazing national work where they have developed teaching tools such as this flip chart. It has information about each of the 10 steps with pictures and guidance for the parents on the front, and on the back of the each step has the research data and citations on the back side for the provider. Sorry about that. And then in January 2016, I was invited to spend some time in India, in Delhi and Jaipur. And I worked at both government and private sector hospitals in India and Jaipur. I want to point out that I think one of the major things, and I'm going to talk about this in some more detail, is everywhere I went, the majority of NICUs were closed to mothers and families. I've seen this quite a bit globally, where mothers were not able to see their babies until they were stable enough to be in the kangaroo mother care room. And so there were a lot of missed opportunities for the protection of human milk and breastfeeding. I did not meet a single mother who had a normal milk supply. And oftentimes providers didn't even have a sense of what normal milk supply. And all the infants primarily received formula as the first feed. And so despite the fact that in India, human milk and breastfeeding is the cultural norm, they were not having good outcomes in any of the NICUs that I worked at in India. Now, I want to point out, I talked about formula company marketing. In Jaipur, where I did the education sessions, you can see that I had to do the education in the Nestle Nutrition Institute Learning Center. So this was at government hospital. So again, that formula marketing is pervasive. In Delhi, I only had the opportunity to do one-day sessions with nurses and physicians, but in Jaipur, we actually were able to do a full week training that involved both didactic content, skills fair, and actually time spent in the neonatal intensive care units. And again, this was at government hospitals in Jaipur. I think some important things to consider when you're thinking about this is that in these NICUs in Jaipur, they had, prior to when I came, all been closed to families. The families had to wait outside. They were not allowed to see their children until the infants were stable enough to go to the kangaroo mother care room. I was very fortunate that I had the support of the physician administrator, Dr. Siddharaman, this young man in the middle, and then our neonatologist champion, Dr. Chetan, who was right there in the action, participating in the didactic education, as you can see here, demonstrating how to do skin to skin and bringing the families into the closed neonatal intensive care units for the first time ever. If you can imagine what this meant to the health professionals, the nurses were extremely proud of the opportunity to learn and really have specific NICU education about human milk and breastfeeding. And many of the nurses brought their families. It was really a historic time for them because they want to do the best thing for their families, but they really lack the knowledge, skills that they needed to be able to implement best practices. So we now have the mothers in the neonatal intensive care units. They're doing oral care with human milk, holding their infant skin to skin. And in one of our hospitals, the human milk rates had tripled just in the first year. So we're now going to kind of get into the meat of some of the steps and how we talk about this and work through this with our families. In the United States and globally, many women don't initiate breastfeeding due to a lack of family support, education, exposure to breastfeeding. I was recently working in the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic is one of the lowest resource countries in the world. And yet you would see in these poor villages without electricity, without running water, families were actually going out and buying infant formula because there were all kinds of myths surrounding breastfeeding. Women didn't want their breasts to sag, their breasts were for their partners. They thought the baby would be stronger on formula. And so even in countries where breastfeeding may be the predominant cultural norm, there are many women who might not have access to the information. and specifically may not have access to information about how critical human milk is in breastfeeding, not only for all infants, but especially for those who are small, sick, or require neonatal intensive care. So one of the focuses of my model and what we have done both here in the US and globally is really talk to health care providers about how you meet with or speak with families even before they deliver. Many times, women who have preterm babies or small sick babies are high risk in their pregnancy. They might have premature labor, they might have diabetes, they may have experiences that put them at high risk. And so if we can meet women even in that high risk pregnancy, we really want to help them understand kind of that dose response of human milk and help families to understand the importance of human milk and set goals related to human milk and breastfeeding. All of our research available, both in the US and around the world, tells us that babies are more likely to die and more likely to have morbidity if they are not fed human milk. And from an ethical standpoint, one really needs to consider the NICU baby who doesn't have voice, and we know that human milk can be the difference between life and death. So focusing our message for the mother who has a critically ill baby, it would be overwhelming to learn everything about human milk and breastfeeding. However, we can have 5 specific talking points for mothers who have critically ill, small, or sick babies. The first talking point is about how human milk protects their baby from infectious processes, and that every day that the mother is expressing milk for her baby or breastfeeding, that baby is getting a new daily dose of vaccine to protect the baby from all types of infectious processes, which is particularly important globally. The second talking point would be the reduction in necrotizing enterocolitis, which, as you all know, it's a 77% risk reduction. And so we certainly do not want to be putting infant formula into a baby's belly, especially as the first feed. We have data here from the United States that conclusively shows us that if the babies can get a 100% human milk diet, we can actually get them off of the IV nutrition quicker. And we know that human milk is associated with better feed tolerance. I think globally, this is not talked a lot about, in terms of brain developmental and developmental outcomes, but really emphasizing the role that human milk has in the development of brain architecture and brain function. We have very strong data right now, MRI data, that shows that babies who receive human milk have more white matter, more gray matter, they have bigger brains. It's associated with better developmental outcomes, both functional, memory, speech, math skills, intelligence, IQ. And so when talking to our families, we really have to help them understand that this is about, human milk is not just feeding their baby or protecting their baby from infection, but this is really brain power and brain protection. And we know that this protects the baby both long-term and short-term. And so kind of that dose-response relationship. Furthermore, because many families have been exposed to formula or they believe formula is a better choice, helping families understand how human milk is different than formula. And so we have 7 specific talking points that we go over with families. First, human milk oligosaccharides, which are prebiotic and probiotic. They're virtually absent in formula, and families are fascinated to know that these are tailored to their infant. We already talked about antibodies or the vaccine protection. The fact that babies who are requiring neonatal intensive care are at risk for oxidative stress, so things like BPD, NEC, ROP, human milk and colostrum are a very powerful antioxidant. Lactoferrin, which is a multi-purpose protein that has been shown to pretty much kill any pathogen that exists. Osteopotin, which develops the baby's gut wall. The white cells that protect both the baby and the milk. And then also the stem cells, which researchers from the University of Western Australia have demonstrated that these stem cells integrate into the infant's brain. So on our website at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, you can actually view the video that we have developed that educates families about the power of human milk and the critical importance of human milk for vulnerable infants. So thinking about human milk as a medical intervention. If we want a mother to be able to make milk for her baby and maintain milk supply through hospital discharge, we need to make sure that she can both establish that milk supply and continue to maintain it all through the hospital stay, whether it be for one infant or for twins or triplets or higher order. So one of the things I hear so many times when I'm speaking globally is a lack of understanding of the process of lactogenesis. And I hear many myths surrounding milk production, where people think there is no milk, or I can't make milk because I had a baby who came early. And I think these pictures here of the ultrasound of the breast, where you can see the first trimester of the breast, the second trimester, and the third trimester, visually you can see that breast development. So the breasts are prepared to make milk and will make milk from 16 weeks of pregnancy on. So no matter how early a mother delivers, she is going to have plenty of milk for that infant. So if the baby is born preterm and small, but is able to directly breastfeed, we absolutely want that baby to the breast. And so even if the baby was born by cesarean section, that should not be a barrier to putting the baby to the breast. We want to prioritize early and frequent skin to skin if the baby is physiologically stable. Some babies are not going to be physiologically stable. They're going to require intubation, mechanical ventilation, and so direct breastfeeding might not be an option for all infants. Milk volume. Very, very many times women get very concerned because they don't get much milk in the beginning, so they think their breasts don't work. We really have to have them understand that colostrum is not a food. It's not meant to grow a baby. It's not meant to get a baby big and fat, but it's there to lay down the baby's immune system. And if you look at this picture here, this represents about an entire 24-hour of colostrum production. And so even though a mother may only express a few drops of colostrum, we want to make sure we prioritizing saving it all. Now, one of the challenging practices or experiences I have working globally is that primarily pump technology is not available in many places. And researchers from the University of Western Australia have really shown us that vacuum is necessary for milk removal, and that the babies actually exert quite a bit of vacuum on the breast in order to get the milk out. And with just using our hands, we don't get an adequate suction vacuum to really convert a mom effectively from lactogenesis 1 to lactogenesis 2. And I saw this in my work both in Thailand and in India. We have research from the United States that shows when mothers actually begin pumping with a hospital-grade pump within 1 hour, they actually have about triple the milk volume at week 3. Now, I understand many people believe that globally this is a challenge to be able to initiate this type of work. However, if you look at this data right here that shows that milk volume and frequency of expression on day 4 are predictive of milk supply at 6 weeks out, and that if you don't achieve a threshold of 500 mLs a day by the end of week 2, a mom isn't going to be able to effectively provide milk for her baby. So here's some pictures from India of some pump stations set up. You can see they have the hospital grade pump in the hospital setting, pumping supplies, a water purifier, and machine to sterilize the pumping equipment. And so the mothers aren't necessarily expressing milk 24 hours a day with a hospital grade pump. They might be using their hands part of the day, but at least part of the day they have access to the hospital grade pump technology to both establish and preserve their milk supply. We've also done this in Thailand, where you can see this is a lactation room with some breast pumps, some breastfeeding support. In Thailand, it's a very hot country, so they have to think about transport. Here you can just see some plastic ice bags of water for families to be able to transport milk to the hospital. And they have been very, very effective in Thailand is setting up lactation clinics where there are pumps for mothers to come in to use, scales to be able to weigh the baby to look at milk transfer. So it doesn't mean that 24 hours a day the mom has to have access to technology, but her having access to technology part of the day is going to increase her ability to establish a normal milk supply. And remember, normal milk supply is a minimum of 500 milliliters a day. So if we have a lot of milk available, it makes that transition to breastfeeding much more effective and able to be carried out. And so step 4 in my model is starting with oral care. Now, some of you may be familiar with the research on oral care, and some of you may be not. There's a nice state of the science that was published that really has shown us that doing human milk oral care is a safe procedure. There is not any harm for infants, that it can benefit infants and lead to potentially an increase in better outcomes as well as breastfeeding. I'd like to point out to you this particular study that was done in Asia, and what they did was implemented a colostrum procedure for premature infants, and in this randomized controlled trial, they reduced the rate of sepsis in their unit, statistically significant, from 92% to 50%. So really important to think about human milk oral care as a way to protect our critically ill infants from infection, even before they may be able to receive human milk in the enteral system. So oral care also benefits the families too. And this is research from our institution at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia by my former doctoral student, Dr. Beth Rowe, who found that it really empowered mothers to want to keep expressing milk for their baby. So that had led the moms to feel like they were involved with their baby's care, and they really wanted to be invested in providing milk for their baby. Now, donor milk. Donor milk is a growing interest globally. One of my concerns about donor milk is that it can't be viewed as a replacement to mom's own milk. It really needs to be viewed as a bridge. Interestingly, this is a sign from one of the hospitals in India where they had a human milk bank. And this milk bank was actually established by the country of Norway in this Indian NICU. And what was fascinating was the nurses, when they had to start feeds on a baby, they would just go to the milk bank and get some pasteurized donor milk with no prioritization of getting moms expressing their own milk or feeding the baby mom's own milk. And so globally, I get concerned about places where they think, oh, we'll just build a milk bank and we'll solve all the world's breastfeeding problems because we have a milk bank. We can't think about donor milk as a replacement to mom's own milk. It's a bridge. We always have to prioritize the feeding of mom's own milk. Skin to skin. I think the first thing I just have to say is NICUs can't be closed to mothers and families. And I've seen this so many countries that I've been in where the families have to wait until their baby is out of neonatal intensive care. They have to wait until their baby is stable enough for kangaroo mother care. And at that point, if we didn't do anything to preserve milk supply and there was no skin-to-skin contact, we might not even be able to breastfeed, even if that's the mom's goal, because we have missed the critical window of opportunity. We have a 2-week period that is critical to establish normal milk supply. So if you are working with critically ill babies, babies that do need to be intubated, they need to be ventilated at birth, we did develop a DVD about how you transfer these intubated babies safely. But certainly we have to prioritize skin-to-skin contact. If the if the infant is stable, i.e. it doesn't require intubation at birth, we absolutely want those babies in kangaroo mother care, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. If mom is available, we want the baby with the mom. Intermittent skin-to-skin, even if the baby is intubated. But both the staff and the families need to be taught how to do this. And when I was working in India in 2016, this was an entirely new concept for both the nurse and physician staff, as well as the families, because prior, the babies were not allowed to get skin-to-skin until they were deemed stable enough to be moved to the kangaroo mother care room. So I think that we have left time for questions. We wanted to make sure that we would have some time. So I have that it's 9:48. So I think we have about 12 minutes for questions. This is my email address to reach me. And then if you want more information about the model that I've developed, there is also a website listed there.
Great, thank you so much for this really interesting presentation. So we have some questions from people online, so I'm just going to start at the beginning. The first question is from Lori, and she asks, have any studies been done comparing outcomes of sick babies fed on mom's milk compared to those fed only parentally and on artificial milks, i.e. how those babies did later in childhood, physically, mentally, and socially?
Absolutely. There is research going back all the way back to the early 70s by Dr. Alan Lucas, looking at outcomes of sick babies, babies who required neonatal intensive care. He has actually followed those infants into adulthood. So he has data on the brain architecture and the differences in brain size, IQ, and intelligence. He has also data that shows the differences in cardiac function and heart function. So there is absolute data that compares mom's own milk to babies who just get, formula. And there's been numerous publications from around the world that really demonstrate the superiority of human milk feeds, not only short-term during the NICU stay, but post-discharge, so affecting things like chronic lung disease and BPD, things like ROP, as I mentioned, brain function.
Great, thank you so much. So the second question is from Sophie Brunel, and she wants to know if there are some experiences of NICU in Africa.
I actually have not had the opportunity to work in Africa. I would love to. At this point, I don't have any specific connections there. But if you have people who are interested, I would absolutely be interested in talking with them. I know that Africa is definitely a different country in terms of resources, but from some of my colleagues at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia who've done some work in Botswana, I know that there is opportunity there in terms of looking at human milk and breastfeeding in the NICU.
Great, thank you so much. So the third question from Jennifer Yurkovich, and she asks, what measures are in place to ensure quality in these hospitals in Thailand and India? And what indicates that these hospital interventions will be sustained?
That's a great question. I think that, this is one of the challenges with the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative, as I brought up in the report from the WHO. So in Thailand, because this work has been going on for about 5 years, we actually do have metrics, and with the Thai Breastfeeding Foundation, they go out and do an assessment of the hospitals. And so for each of the 10 steps of my model, we have quality metrics for the hospitals to measure. We're doing this in the United States right now in the state of Florida. And so all this data gets collected to ensure that we're following through with what the education is. I think your point is very critically important, because it's one thing to say, oh, we're going to give this great support. It's another thing to actually see the outcomes. I think two really, really important outcomes that you have to look at is, what is the baby fed for the first feed? Is the baby getting human milk or colostrum, or is it being fed formula or donor milk? Because we really want it to be fed mom's own milk. And then what is happening through that neonatal intensive care? Are we able to maintain a normal milk supply through the entire neonatal intensive care stay? And is the baby able to go home breastfeeding? But you absolutely need to do monitoring and metrics. And when I worked in India, we also developed similar but different kind of data collection tools and monitoring devices.
Great, thank you. The fourth question is from Katie Beck from Partners in Health, and she wanted to know, in the hospitals in Thailand, is there a milk bank? And then do you store breast milk? And what is the staffing like on these NICUs? Is there someone in charge of lactation?
Well, that's a great question. So first of all, there is not any milk bank presently that is government regulated through the whole country of Thailand. There are some local hospital-based milk banks, but it's not the same as, for example, Europe or North America, where there's a governing agency for milk banks. So in Thailand, milk banking is primarily not present. The same situation exists in India, where there are individual milk banks set up at different hospitals, but there's not a kind of national agenda or an overseeing body. But mother's own milk is stored in the hospital setting, so that both in India and Thailand, they were able to get limited funding, but to have refrigerators as well as freezers that are on generators to be able to store mother's own milk. So that has been something, again, different depending on where you are and whether it was a government hospital or a private hospital, and what access to funds they had. But certainly you need some ability to store human milk in either a refrigerator or freezer. And I think there was one more part of that question that I forgot what it was, if you want to remind me.
So the second part of the question was
staffing.
The staffing, yeah, and lactation.
Yeah. So, golly, I have seen staffing ratios that have ranged from one nurse for 12 babies to one nurse for 8 babies to one nurse for 4 babies. So very, very significant staffing ratio differences across the countries I have worked in globally. which obviously, as you can imagine, is a huge challenge for providing human milk and breastfeeding support. So in India, when we did the work in Jaipur, the idea of creating the specific lactation nurses, that was something that these nurses were still working as a neonatal intensive care unit nurse. However, they had the additional education and support to now provide the moms with that human milk and breastfeeding education. So they were still having to do their normal job, but they were also skilled up to provide the breastfeeding support. In Thailand, some of the hospitals have been able to dedicate nurses to provide just lactation support, and they've had these lactation clinics, but that is not by far across the board. What I have found in my work, both in the United States and abroad, is that if we take lactation and we make it separate than the rest of the NICU care, it becomes disjointed. And so really what is important from an education and training standpoint of both nurses and physicians is that we have to look at ways that we incorporate human milk and breastfeeding as part of standard neonatal care. And I have some curriculums and models that we've developed and published about.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. We have like another 4 minutes, so we'll just take 2 more questions now. And so the 5th question is from Sophie Bernal, and she wants to know, do you meet similar barriers from families receiving human milk as for blood bank, such as fear to become weak or risk of disease transmission?
I think that's a fabulous question. Absolutely. If families don't understand the process of milk donation and the screening processes, there can be barriers. I will just tell you that later this year, early next year, there's going to be a whole series about human milk and milk donation in the Journal of Obstetric, Gynecological, and Neonatal Nursing. I'm the guest editor for that. So there'll be 5 publications about this topic.
Great, thank you so much. And then the 6th question and last is from Judy Kanawati, and she wanted to ask, since WHO is looking at the issue of extending BFHI to the NICU, are they looking at your model, and are you involved in the discussions about training and assessment?
So I've had some involvement with the work that was done from Sweden in the Nordic model. There was a conference in 2011 and again in 2015 where I spoke at both of those neonatal baby-friendly conferences. My understanding at the time from the WHO and also more recently when I talked to Larry Grumer-Strom is that the WHO is seemingly looking to want to have each country develop their own standards for the NICU versus trying to develop global standards because of the differences from each country to each country. So what the latest that I've heard is really that they're looking at, wanting each country to develop this specifically. So that's how we've been addressing it.
Okay, with that, we sadly have to conclude this wonderful webinar. Thank you so much, Diane. That was excellent. There are so many interesting resources you included, different journal articles. We hope to be able to have knowledge of the last journal article you were talking about that will be coming out about barriers and be able to share that with the community too. You had so many excellent points, and I'll only remark on one, that we need champions for these. So I hope all of us on this webinar consider ourselves champions, and I hope we're creating other champions. I'm sure we are. Please be sure and tune in tomorrow for the last webinar in this series on Revitalizing the Baby-Friendly Hospital Initiative, Experiences from Malawi. You will reach it through this same Adobe Connect link. Thank you. Have a good day or evening.
Thank you, Diane.
Thank you. Thank you.